John.
Yes, we do.
I want to thank all of you for reaching out, your cards, your notes. Many times I started reading them and I had to walk away for a couple hours before I could go back. I know some of you, probably all of you, felt shut out of my life, and there were reasons for that, and I'll explain that. A friend of mine years ago told me that when you see a load limit sign on a bridge, like 5-ton limit, they really don't know if that's what it takes to break it until the bridge is broken. Sometimes it takes 4 tons, 1,500 pounds. Sometimes it takes and can withstand over 5 tons. But until it's broke, you don't know what it takes. And on October 4th, my bridge broke. It was a stress break. And as you know, stress is a state of mental or emotional strain, pressure, or tension resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances. And many times the reaction to that is anxiety. The day's events, I wouldn't recall what happened on October 4th for almost 2 weeks later. I had had quite a bit of sleeping problems the last few weeks. And that week I hadn't slept for 4 nights. You remember just 2 weeks earlier, I said if I could have called in sick this morning, I would have. The reason why I said that was because I hadn't slept in 2 or 3 nights. And I know when I don't sleep, I don't think right. I don't really remember a lot of the events. My wife came home that night, and I had been involved in some activities that day here and around church, and I went home that night because I hadn't slept in 4 nights and took very strong sleeping meds. And when my wife came home later that night, she tried to talk to me. I was sitting on the couch, and she said I was unresponsive. And it was like I was in a daze. And I couldn't respond to her. And I learned not too long after that, I had left the house. And I walked out the front door and through a field, through a wooded area, down the road. I don't know how all the stuff, but my son, one of my sons, called a friend and a neighbor and asked him if he'd get in his truck and go find him. I don't really know what I was doing. I don't know if I was walking to clear my head. A friend of mine who was a pastor in Vancouver, Washington for a number of years, his name Gerald Marvel. One day they found him on the road walking. And they stopped and asked him, Gerald, what are you doing? And he said, I'm trying to clear my head. I think if I can walk to Mount Hood, which was 60 miles away and back, I think I'll be better. And I don't know what I was trying to do that night. I don't remember the events. My friend tells me that he found me along the road, and he just laid next to me, put his arm around me. He said, I'm going to stay here with you until you're ready to go home. And he brought me home that night. And I went in the house, and I think Deb thought I was all right. And sometime after that, I left my office, got in my truck. I don't remember getting in my truck. I don't remember driving. And I ended up at a place not too far from Frank Curtis' house. Someone asked me later, did I try to drive to Frank's house to talk to him. And I don't know. Maybe I did. I don't know. But they found me some 20 hours later, and I was in my truck. The windows were up. It was hot. And from the heat and the meds, it left me overheated in my body. I was dehydrated, and I was in acute renal failure, which is where many of you picked the story up when you heard about it. I didn't really come around until about the second day in ICU. All the events that happened around that were totally unclear to me. My wife had never seen me in this condition, and she was concerned and didn't want anybody else to see me in this. So my wife, who loves me deeply, went into a protective mode, and she blocked everybody out except my family. My kids all flew in. And so if you felt blocked out, that's why. My wife did not want anyone to see me in the condition I was in. And out of protection and love, she blocked everyone out. I spent 4 days in ICU. And after that, they asked me if I would go to a crisis stabilization unit. And it's a place where they kind of take you to see if you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And I remember the night they were describing it to me, and every psychotic movie I've seen of mental wards came through my mind. They told me when you get there, they're going to take all your clothes and wash them. You're going to have to shower. I don't know. It made me a nervous wreck, but finally I know my family wanted me to go, and so I did. And basically they want to know that you're okay. And I spent 5 days there. And I kept thinking, what was it that caused my bridge to break? Well, the list is long, and there's a lot of emotional stress and strain and demanding circumstances. Some of it is just being a pastor. And here at the church, there have been a number of stressful events that have left my bridge weakened through this year. Plus, there's 36 long years of full-time ministry that my wife and I have been involved with together, and it has taken a toll on us. I learned while I was in the stabilization unit that 1,500 pastors a month leave the ministry because they can't take it anymore. And I have fought for a long time not to be one of those statistics. I learned a couple weeks after this, the events that happened on October 4th. Some of it, when people told me what happened, I remembered. Some of it still is cloudy to today. But I was at a funeral that morning. I didn't really remember the funeral and don't know who it was even right now. I was at a funeral dinner that day, and while at the dinner, a lovely lady in our church who just buried her husband just a few months earlier found out her only living brother died. And I didn't eat lunch that day, and the meds I was on to go to Africa, you take the medicine the same day, the same time. That medicine I should have taken with lunch, I didn't take that day because I didn't eat lunch, and I don't know if that affected me or not. I'll tell you about that in a minute. That afternoon, I met with a man who was going to lead our Bible study that Saturday morning. He was in there, and we were talking. He was telling me his story. And in the midst of telling his story, he started telling about his son who was a pastor that had gone through a church split and how it broke his heart and how it broke his heart as a father seeing his son go through this. And I remember tears came in his eyes, and he said, I know this church went through that in 2013. He said, have you ever experienced pain like that? And unfortunately, I was able to tell him about the pain that I went through. And I told my story, and I cried. After meeting with him, my daytimer tells me I made the home visit to the lady who had lost her only brother. I'd gone to Windsor Care to visit someone, and then I went to the student and youth ministries. what I usually do on Wednesday nights. And then I went home and I took some strong meds so that I could sleep, since I hadn't slept in 4 days. My counselor says that all or any of those events could have been a trigger that was my breaking point. After I got out, I talked to a buddy of mine that we went to several Honduras mission trips, and we talked about what happened. He asked me a question. He said, "You know, John, there was a med that we told ourselves we wouldn't take because of the adverse effect that was going on in the 90s when people were taking it." And I said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "I only took one med. A lot of people took a lot of meds." And then he asked me what one I took, and he goes, "John, you need to go back and read the information about that." And when I did, you know, they give you a sheet when you get your meds at the pharmacist to pre-warn you about warnings. And this warning said this, that this medicine may cause mental, mood, or nervous system problems, such as anxiety, depression, restlessness, confusion, hallucination, suicidal thoughts, suicidal attempts, ringing in the ears, trouble sleeping, numbness, vision changes, unusual tiredness, nausea, vomiting, and dark urine. Well, as I began to think about that, I wondered about the problem that I've had with sleeping and the events that were going on there, and wondered if that's what kept me from sleeping before I went to Africa, while I was there, even when I came back, and caused this high anxiety level. Now, I know that there were 14 other people that went with me to Africa, and you might be thinking, well, did any of those meds affect them? Well, on this sheet it says, remember that your doctor has prescribed this medication because he or she judged that the benefit to you is greater than the risk of the side effects. Many people using this medication do not have serious side effects. My counselor says that I may never completely understand exactly what happened, because he said any or all those events could have triggered what went on in my life. I know the week before I went to Africa, I almost said, I'm not going. I felt my emotions were out of control and anxiety was high. I felt like I was in a plane and it was in a nosedive and I couldn't stop. I felt like everything was just pushing me over the edge more and more. And I almost said, I can't go, but I'm the one that started this. How could I back out? But my personality is always to push through. My counselor said what drives me, if it's not controlled properly, can be the thing that devastates my life. I felt such high anxiety even when I went to Africa. On occasion, I would have to leave our group and go by myself and cry and try to pull myself together emotionally and tell myself, this is not you. This is not John Henry. What is wrong with you? One day when team teaching with Ronnie Hall, we were in a sanctuary and the rain was, it was raining outside and it was beating on this tin roof and I could barely hear it. Those of you who know me well know I have trouble hearing anyways when it's a perfectly quiet place. And this just added to my anxiety. I couldn't hear what they were saying, and then you have the accent of the Africans, and then they were talking soft, and I was trying to field questions and talk to them. And I mean, I felt myself, the anxiety building up, my hands were shaking, and I finally looked at Ronnie and said, I can't do this. I need you to teach right now. Unfortunately, Ronnie took the reins and he taught for the next hour, and I just sat there trying to hold myself together, telling myself, you cannot break down here. After coming back from Africa, I still had problems sleeping, and I mean going nights completely without sleeping. And I don't know why, but that week I started thinking about people I hadn't seen around church, and I started calling people and found out that they had left the church for one reason or another. And I don't know why I'm this way, but I bear all that on me when people leave the church. It bothers me when people don't get involved in the church. It bothers me when I don't feel people are committed to the church. I take that personal, and that 2 weeks, it was even, it ramped up even more in my life with my anxiety. I was anxious about our debt, asking people to re-up for pledges for another year, thinking about how the debt in my last church was such a distraction and such a burden on me and the entire church. It just felt like it was just holding us back and down. And then the general grind of ministry day in and day out. I don't know what or which one of these things, but something was the trigger point that caused my bridge to collapse. And now I deal with the question of how could a guy that stands up week in, week out, teaching the Word of God, the living Word of God, telling people how to get their life together and can't keep his life from falling apart. You see, my heroes, I had my friend Anthony Munoz come in, and he's the only Hall of Famer from the Bengals, and Bob Russell's been here. And, you know, my heroes are the pastors who've stayed in this thing. Frank Curtis has been in the ministry 50-some years. Even when he moved back here, he took a church south of here just to be the interim, and he was there 8 years. He's now our interim state pastor. He works around here and things. Tom Wyatt's father is 80-some years old, gets up from Camargo every Sunday morning and drives 30 minutes south to go preach to a bunch of people down there. I never wanted to be one of these guys that didn't make it to the My counselor said, John, you remember when you get on a plane, they run through all those instructions? They go through the seatbelt deal, and then they talk about the oxygen mask if they're deployed. He said, John, let me tell you something. They tell you to put your mask on first before you help anyone else. He said, I'm going to tell you what your problem is, and it's a problem with a lot of pastors. You've been running around the plane helping everybody get their oxygen mask on, and you found yourself half dead in the aisle wondering how you got there. And he said, John, if you don't learn how to take care of yourself first, you're not going to make it. So I'm learning these days about self-care. Sounds pretty selfish as a pastor, but I'm learning it. Every morning I get up and I consciously put on my oxygen mask because I don't want to ever find myself there again. The fourth morning I was at this crisis stabilization unit. My counselor, who God was so gracious, gave me a Christian counselor. He had been working with me for 4 days trying to crack and understand what was going on. And finally he got up early that morning and he said, God, I want you to show me something. And he said, I figured if you pastored a large church, there's got to be something out there about you. And so he went to the computer that morning and he Googled John Henry Central Community Church in Wichita, Kansas. Now before that, when I walked into the office that morning, he set his phone down and he said, John, I want to play something for you on the phone. He said, I don't want you to respond. I don't want you to talk. I don't want you to say anything. I said, okay. He goes, I've got something on my phone here. To be honest with you, my mind was wondering, good night. Is this my wife called and said, hey, I don't want that cuckoo nut job back at our house, so you tell him that I don't want this anymore, so you do it. I had no idea. Everything goes through your mind in a little 30-second little run-through. And he started playing, and the second he played it, I knew the voice. It was me. And he told me, after listening to it, he said, John, what is the likelihood you spent 18 years in one church? How many sermons is that? And he said, what is the likelihood, when I went on YouTube and Googled that, there was 3 minutes and 50 seconds of one of your message, the only thing that was ever on the computer or on the internet right now that has your name. And he said, John, I'm going to tell you something. It's a prophecy of why you're here this week. And then he played the tape back slowly and talked about each and every part of it. Well, I came today against the advice of my counselor. He did not want me to come. But I love you, And I know you love me, and I know you wanted to see me, and I know you wanted to know I was okay. And frankly, I personally wanted to tell you my story. I know there are a lot of rumors out in the community about my breakdown. I know people said John had a breakdown because John had an affair. John had a breakdown because his wife had an affair. You know, John was drunk. They found throw up all over his truck. You know, people have said if John comes back, we're not staying at the church. I've heard all these things, and this is part of the reason. My wife has fought to keep information from me. But let me tell you what I believe. When we had a church split in my last church, and those of you who are here 4 years know what this church went through. And maybe you've been to another church somewhere else that went through it. But they brought in a group, and really, to be honest with you, every church that goes through a church split needs to have a group come in. It was led by a guy named Dr. John Steffens. And for 6 weeks they came in and they talked to everybody on both sides, everything about it, heard everything. When I came back after 6 weeks, Dr. Steffens pulled me aside and he said, John, I want to tell you something. There are going to be many people that want to come in and talk to you. They want to hear your side of the story. They want to see if you can throw more mud on somebody else than they threw on you. And you're going to think if you can do that, you're going to convince them. He said, let me tell you this. If they're your friends, they don't have to know any of the detail. They just need to know, how can I help? He said the others only want to know the information so they can either gossip or use it to tear you down. He said, John, I'm going to tell you this, and I want you to remember this every time somebody walks in your office. He said, they're not going to tell you this, but this is what they're thinking. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've already made up my mind. So don't waste your time on that. I've talked to the elders, and I told them because they offered to cover me through the end of the year. And we talked this last Thursday about me coming back in January. And if it is right for them for me to come back, and it's right for Debbie and I to come back, then I will be back in January. Until that time, Deb and I will be seeking Deb and I will be seeking rest and renewal. If I run into you, don't feel like you have to avoid me. This will be on my Facebook if I gave you too much information for you not to keep. And I wanted to put it on there today because I don't want to tell this story 100 times. And I'm hoping that other pastors that listen to this will catch themselves before they get in this downward spiral. I love you all. And Deb and I love you. And I'm sorry that you felt shut out of our lives, but it was protection. And that's how my wife is. And my kids wanted it to be that way.